June 19th, 1944. Task Force 58, operating under a vast and unforgiving sky in the western expanses of the Philippine Sea. Deep within the armored, steel-ribbed bowels of the fleet carrier USS Lexington, a war of a different kind was being waged. Here, in the dimly lit, claustrophobic, and yet precisely ordered confines of the Combat Information Center, CIC, the ship's electronic nerve center, the abstract language of physics and geometry was being translated into the brutal calculus of life and death. The air was thick with the low hum of ventilation systems and the faint smell of ozone from the electronic equipment. Young, intensely focused radar operators, their faces bathed in the eerie, phosphorescent green glow of their scopes, stared intently at the sweeping lines of light, their eyes trained to discern the subtle, almost imperceptible blips that signified approaching aircraft amidst a sea of static and false returns. These ghostly signatures, once the esoteric curiosities of scientists, were now the harbingers of an impending storm, meticulously plotted by sailors with grease pencils on massive, transparent plexiglass boards. Their courses, speeds, and altitudes were transformed from abstract data points into tangible intercept vectors, lines on a map that would soon guide hundreds of American fighters to a violent and decisive confrontation. Suddenly, the quiet, professional hum was pierced by a staccato burst of Morse code, a signal relayed from the crushing depths of the ocean hundreds of miles away. The message, decoded in seconds, was from the submarine USS Albacore, which had been tenaciously shadowing the Japanese fleet. Enemy carrier force detected. Cited multiple air groups launching from decks. Attack on our main force is imminent. In the Fighter Direction Center of the Lexington, Lieutenant Charles Sims, the senior fighter director for this sector, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. He calmly adjusted the heavy headphones over his ears, the low hiss of static a constant backdrop to the calm, clipped voices of his controllers reporting contacts and ranges. He reached for the heavy Bakelite handle of the radio transmitter, his hand steady, knowing that his next words, amplified across the fleet's command network, would unleash a whirlwind of controlled, industrial-scale violence. Across the immensity of Task Force 58, a sprawling, mobile city of steel, firepower, and aviation fuel stretching for miles across the ocean surface. 15 American aircraft carriers, from the mighty fleet carriers to the smaller, more nimble light carriers, would begin to turn into the wind. On their decks, a symphony of chaos would erupt. The roar of engines, the high-pitched whine of starters, the shouts of plane handlers, and the thunderous clap of propellers biting into the thick, humid air. Legendary names from the annals of naval warfare. The USS Lexington, reborn after her predecessor was lost at the Coral Sea. The indomitable USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship of the war, and the new USS Yorktown, continuing the legacy of her own fallen namesake, would become the epicenters of this aerial eruption. What none of the men in that CIC, nor the young pilots strapping themselves into their cockpits, clenching their jaws and running through their pre-flight checks, could possibly know was that this single, sun-drenched day would bear witness to the most lopsided, brutally efficient, and utterly catastrophic aerial massacre in the entire bloody history of naval warfare. The Pacific War, a brutal, 3-year-long education written in fire, steel, and the blood of thousands, had taught the aviators and strategists of the United States Navy a crucial and unforgiving lesson. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy were not just skilled and determined adversaries. They were, in the early years of the war, a force of nature, the inheritors of the samurai tradition, an airborne elite of a warrior culture that valued death in battle above all else. In the dark days of 1941 and 1942, their skill, particularly when flying the nimble and legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, had seemed almost mythical, their victories swift and devastating. But the American strategic calculus had evolved, forged in the fires of near disaster at the Coral Sea and the miraculous, tide-turning victory at Midway. The new doctrine, born from bitter experience and cold, hard analysis, was simple, pragmatic, and ruthless. Destroy Japan's irreplaceable veteran pilots, and their aircraft carriers, no matter how powerful or numerous, would become little more than floating, defenseless targets, vulnerable to American submarines and dive bombers. The planes themselves, the Zeros and the Vals and the Kates, could be replaced, but the accumulated, almost intuitive skill of a veteran aviator with thousands of hours of flight time could not be mass-produced. It was a resource more precious than steel or oil. Now, in the summer of 1944, that very doctrine was about to be put to its ultimate and most violent test. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a skilled and respected commander of the Japanese mobile fleet, had meticulously assembled the largest and most powerful carrier striking force that the dwindling industrial and human resources of the Japanese Empire could still muster. It was a formidable armada on paper, a final, desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to halt the inexorable American advance across the Pacific and turn the tide of the war. 9 aircraft carriers, the brand-new, heavily armored carrier Taiho, serving as Ozawa's flagship. The veteran fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, survivors of nearly every major naval battle of the war, and the smaller carriers Junyo, Hayo, Ryoho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuho, formed the powerful core of his fleet. Aboard them were 430 of Japan's best remaining carrier aircraft, a force positioned to deliver a single, decisive, knockout blow against the American invasion of Saipan. The capture of this island by the Americans was an existential threat to Japan, as its airfields would place the new, long-range B-29 bombers within easy striking range of the Japanese home islands, bringing the war home to Japanese civilians for the first time. The Imperial Japanese Navy's complex and ambitious battle plan, codenamed Operation Ago, was predicated on a critical and ultimately fatal assumption that hundreds of land-based aircraft stationed on the nearby and heavily fortified islands of Guam, Rota, and Tinian would supplement the carrier-based strikes. Combined with the aircraft of the mobile fleet, a theoretical force of over 500 planes would, according to the plan, overwhelm the American defenses in a series of perfectly coordinated sequential waves, sinking the American carriers and leaving the vulnerable invasion force on Saipan isolated and ripe for destruction. The stakes could not have been higher, a fact made chillingly clear by Admiral Somu Toyota, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, in a stark and unambiguous declaration that was read to every man in the fleet. The fate of the Empire rests on this one battle. Every man is expected to do his utmost, slicing through the thick, humid Pacific thermals at a blistering 380 miles per hour. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the physical embodiment of America's industrial and philosophical answer to the Japanese challenge. It was not a graceful or nimble dogfighter in the same vein as the Zero. It was a beast, a heavyweight champion, a brutal instrument of war designed for a singular, bloody purpose. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder, 2-row, air-cooled radial marvel of engineering, generated a thunderous 2,000 horsepower, propelling 12,598 pounds of armor plate, firepower, and fuel through the contested airspace with terrifying speed and authority. In the cramped, smoke-filled ready room aboard the fleet carrier USS Essex, Commander David McCampbell, one of the Navy's most gifted and aggressive air group commanders, stood before his pilots, his calm, almost professorial demeanor belying the ferocious intensity of the moment. He studied the tactical situation being sketched out on the plotting board, his mind a rapid-fire calculator processing the vectors, altitudes, and fuel states, meticulously planning the systematic destruction of the incoming enemy. His Air Group 15, was a finely honed and lethal weapon, its 104 pilots having been trained for months in a singular, deadly art, the killing of Japanese aircraft. Every one of his F-6F Hellcat fighters carried a devastating and reliable arsenal. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each fed by a deep magazine of 400 rounds of ammunition, and, crucially, protecting the most valuable component of the weapon system, the man in the cockpit, was a heavy cocoon of 212 pounds of strategically placed armor plating around the cockpit, engine, and oil cooler, a feature that would prove utterly decisive in the coming battle. The Hellcat represented the absolute zenith of American industrial engineering philosophy. It was a machine designed not by artists seeking aerodynamic perfection, but by pragmatists who understood the brutal, unforgiving realities of modern aerial combat. Unlike the exquisitely crafted but notoriously fragile Mitsubishi Zero, which sacrificed nearly all protection and structural integrity for unparalleled maneuverability and climb rate, the F-6F prioritized survivability and overwhelming firepower above all else. The engineers at Grumman, taking critical lessons learned from analyzing a captured Zero that had crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands, had famously designed the Hellcat to be, in their words, built around the biggest engine we could find, and then armored it to withstand an incredible amount of punishment and bring its pilot home. This design philosophy was a direct reflection of a nation that valued its highly trained and difficult-to-replace pilots as an irreplaceable national resource. Each of the Hellcat's 6 heavy machine guns fired a devastating mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds at a blistering rate of 850 rounds per minute. The ballistics were unforgiving and meticulously calculated. While it was true that a skilled Zero pilot could still outturn a Hellcat in a slow-speed, horizontal-turning fight, that was a fight the American pilots were rigorously and repeatedly trained to avoid at all costs. The Hellcat Pilot's Bible, drilled into them by veteran instructors, was built on the fundamental principles of energy management. The doctrine was simple and brutally effective. Use the fighter's superior speed, its phenomenal rate of climb, its incredible diving ability to dictate the terms of every single engagement. The American tactic was to make one high-speed, boom and zoom pass, fire a devastatingly accurate burst, and then use the Hellcat's superior power and energy retention to climb away, repositioning for another attack from a position of advantage. The Hellcat, with its overwhelming firepower, needed only a 2-second burst of accurate fire to utterly disintegrate any Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashew, a thoughtful and highly analytical pilot from the famed Fighting Squadron 16, VF-16, aboard the USS Lexington, had spent 8 long, grueling months of combat meticulously studying and applying those statistics. A DePauw University graduate with a sharp, mathematical mind perfectly suited for the complex, three-dimensional geometry of deflection, shooting, and energy management, Vrashew understood better than most that aerial combat was not a romantic joust between knights of the air. It was a brutal and unforgiving application of physics. He knew that kinetic energy, a direct function of altitude and speed, was the essential currency of survival in a dogfight. It determined who could acquire the target first. It dictated the possible deflection angles for a shot. It provided the ability to escape a dangerous situation or to press an attack. The razor-thin, almost imperceptible difference between a glorious victory and a fiery death often came down to split-second positioning, superior situational awareness, and the overwhelming, concentrated application of superior firepower. The American force that had assembled for this decisive, world-altering battle was, by any measure, staggering in its sheer scale and overwhelming power. Task Force 58, under the brilliant and aggressive command of the legendary Vice Admiral Mark P. Mitchell, had become the most powerful and mobile naval striking force ever assembled in the entire history of human warfare. It comprised a massive fleet of 15 fleet and light fleet carriers, deploying a staggering total of 956 aircraft, including a formidable and deadly core of 475 F-6F Hellcat fighters. Against this seemingly invincible, globe-spanning armada, Admiral Ozawa could muster only 430 carrier aircraft, supplemented by approximately 100 land-based planes of dubious quality and questionable readiness. The stark, brutal mathematics were clear. The Japanese were outnumbered nearly 2-1 before the first shot was even fired. Aboard his magnificent flagship, the new carrier Taiho, Vice Admiral Ozawa reviewed his meticulously crafted and complex battle plan one last time. His 430 aircraft were organized into a series of 4 sequential attack waves, a tactic designed to hit the American fleet in a relentless, overwhelming succession that would, he hoped, saturate their defenses. His first mobile fleet displaced over 65,000 tons of the finest carrier steel that the strained Japanese shipyards could still produce. His air groups contained the best pilots that Japan had left, men who had trained for months, preparing for this one single decisive engagement that would determine the fate of their nation. But the Imperial Japanese Navy's greatest and most fatal weakness remained the same deeply ingrained vulnerability that had plagued it since the disastrous and tide-turning Battle of Midway 2 years earlier: the crushing, almost criminal inexperience of its replacement pilots. The elite, battle-hardened veterans of Pearl Harbor, the triumphant Indian Ocean raids, and the bloody early carrier battles have been steadily and relentlessly attritioned, their irreplaceable, hard-won skills lost forever in the unforgiving skies and waters of the Pacific. Their replacements, brave and willing as they were a pale and inadequate shadow of their predecessors. They averaged fewer than 200 flying hours in their logbooks, a stark and tragic contrast to the American pilots who entered combat with a minimum of 500 hours of intensive, high-quality, and standardized training. This critical disparity went far deeper and was more consequential than just the raw number of flight hours. The American pilot training program had become a vast and highly efficient industrial process in itself, a highly refined and systematic curriculum that was designed to produce not just pilots who could fly an airplane, but proficient, deadly, and survivable naval aviators. They received extensive and realistic gunnery training, firing thousands of rounds at towed targets until deflection shooting became second nature. They made dozens, sometimes hundreds, of practice carrier landings, mastering the terrifying and unforgiving art of landing a high-performance, 12,000-pound aircraft on a pitching, moving, and often rain-slick deck that was only a few hundred feet long. And they received rigorous, mandatory instruction in instrument flying, a skill that was becoming increasingly vital in the unpredictable and often violent weather of the Pacific theater. Their Japanese counterparts, in tragic contrast, were rushed through a drastically truncated and woefully inadequate training program. Many had never actually fired their aircraft's guns at an aerial target before entering their first combat mission. A significant number had performed fewer than 10 actual, heart-stopping carrier landings, and their navigation training was shockingly minimal, a deficiency that forced them to rely almost entirely on their flight leaders to guide their large and unwieldy formations to and from the target. This critical and systemic deficiency would have devastating and fatal consequences for hundreds of young men in the chaos of the coming battle. As the two colossal fleets, still hundreds of miles apart and unseen by each other's lookouts, steamed inexorably towards their violent rendezvous, the profound technological and doctrinal advantages of the American force began to assert themselves with a silent, electronic certainty long before the first aircraft would meet in the crucible of combat. The American ships were arrayed in a series of vast, concentric, and mutually supporting defensive rings, a complex and highly evolved tactical formation that was a masterpiece of naval doctrine, designed specifically for layered, in-depth defense against massed air attack. On the absolute outer perimeter, a screen of agile, fast destroyers, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns, acted as the first line of both anti-submarine and anti-aircraft defense, their crews scanning the seas and skies with relentless vigilance. Inside this protective screen, a formidable ring of heavily armed battleships and cruisers, including veterans of Pearl Harbor, now bristling with modern weaponry, provided a dense and terrifying curtain of medium and heavy anti-aircraft fire, their gun directors guided by their own advanced radar systems. And at the very center of this floating fortress of steel, protected within this multi-layered shield, were the priceless and vulnerable aircraft carriers, the beating heart of the task force. Every single major ship in this sprawling formation swept the sky with a new and revolutionary technology that was fundamentally changing the face of naval warfare: radar. Advanced SK and SC air search radar systems, with their large, rotating antennas, provided long-range early warning of approaching aircraft formations, while sophisticated SM fighter direction radars, smaller and more precise, provided accurate bearing and, crucially, altitude data on the incoming targets. Deep within the armored hulls of the carriers, in specially designed, air-conditioned compartments that offered a surreal, quiet contrast to the heat and noise of the ship, teams of highly trained fighter direction officers worked with a calm, practiced, and almost surgical efficiency. Their plotting boards, massive sheets of transparent plexiglass illuminated from below, were a flurry of controlled and purposeful activity. Young sailors, trained to write backwards with grease pencils so the officers on the other side could read their plots, meticulously tracked the course, speed, and altitude of every single radar contact within a 150-mile radius. It was a complex, high-pressure, and mentally taxing symphony of information gathering, filtering, and dissemination. A true neural network for the entire fleet, capable of processing vast amounts of data in real time. Radar Operator First Class James Peterson, stationed in the dimly lit CIC of the USS Lexington, had been tracking these ghostly electronic contacts for 14 long, grueling months, a journey that had taken him from the malaria-infested jungles of the Solomons to the coral atolls of the Marshalls. His hands moved with an ingrained, almost subconscious grace across the myriad dials and controls of his radar console as he adjusted the gain and sweep rate, expertly filtering out the sea clutter, the distracting, false returns that bounced off the ocean's surface to reveal the true, unvarnished picture of the airspace around them. On this particular morning, the meteorological conditions were, for the Americans, absolutely perfect for radar detection. Clear, azure skies, virtually unlimited visibility, and no rain or atmospheric disturbances to create the false returns that could mask an approaching enemy. At precisely 10 a.m. on the morning of June 19th, Peterson's radar scope, which had been relatively quiet for the past hour, suddenly and dramatically erupted with a dense, pulsating cluster of contacts. The blips were sharp, unambiguous, and numerous. Range 150 miles, bearing 260, altitude, Angels 20, he announced into his headset, his voice a model of professional calm, though his heart was pounding with a surge of adrenaline. He immediately slammed the palm of his hand down on the jarring, clanging general quarters alarm, its raucous sound echoing through the ship's passageways, and reached for the intercom that connected him directly to the bridge. Bridge, CIC. We have a large raid, bearing 260, range 150 miles, Angels 20. I say again, large raid inbound. Aboard Admiral Ozawa's flagship, the magnificent and ill-fated Taiho, the first Japanese attack wave had been launched at 0830. It was by any standard a formidable force of 69 aircraft, 16 of the legendary A-6M0 fighters flying escort, 45 of the sleek and fast Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, and 8 of the potent Nakajima B-6 and Jill torpedo bombers. The launch itself, a complex and inherently dangerous evolution involving hundreds of men and dozens of moving aircraft on a crowded flight deck, had taken a full 23 minutes to complete from the moment the first aircraft began its takeoff roll to the final, circling assembly of the entire formation. Their flight plan was a carefully calculated and rigid balance of speed and endurance, the entire formation cruising at a relatively slow 180 knots in order to conserve precious fuel for the long, 90-minute flight to the target, and, with a hope that bordered on prayer, the long journey home. Back in the cool, quiet confines of the Lexington CIC, Fighter Director Lieutenant Joseph Edgar, a master of this new, electronic form of warfare, swiftly plotted the intercept geometry on his plexiglass status board. The enemy's speed was estimated at 180 knots, their course a direct, unwavering line of roughly 80 degrees, aimed like an arrow at the very heart of Task Force 58. A quick, practice calculation, scribbled on a notepad, showed the time to intercept to be approximately 35 minutes, provided the fleet's own fighters, its Combat Air Patrol, CAP, could be launched immediately and vectored out efficiently. The entire science of modern naval air interception, a science the U.S. Navy had perfected through bloody trial and error, depended on these precise, rapid calculations, factoring in complex vector geometry, the known climb rates of their own aircraft, and the critical, ever-present variable of fuel management. Aboard his own flagship, the USS Hornet, Admiral Mark Mitcher's response to the incoming threat was immediate, aggressive, and decisive. He had absolutely no intention of waiting passively for the enemy to come to him, allowing them to get within striking distance of his precious carriers. His entire doctrine was based on pushing his defenses as far out as possible, engaging and destroying the enemy long before they could see his ships. Launch all fighters, he ordered over the fleet-wide command network, his voice calm and firm. Vector 260, climb to Angels 25 and engage at will. The first F-6F Hellcat, its engine screaming at full power, roared off the flight deck of the USS Essex at 10:23 a.m. Within a breathtakingly short and incredibly efficient span of just 12 minutes, a staggering 140 Hellcats were airborne from the decks of multiple carriers, clawing for altitude as they climbed into the sun, forming up into squadrons and divisions as they raced to meet the incoming raid. Each and every one of those pilots had been meticulously briefed on Japanese tactics, on instant aircraft recognition, and on the cardinal, unbreakable rule of air combat: maintain the altitude advantage at all costs. The Hellcats, with their powerful and reliable double Wasp engines, climbed at a phenomenal rate of 3,000 feet per minute, giving them a crucial and ultimately decisive edge in the vital race to get on top of the enemy formation before the engagement began. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 15, VF-15, from the USS Essex, was at the very tip of this avenging spear. His 16 fighters, organized into 4 tightly knit 4-plane divisions, were climbing relentlessly through 20,000 feet when the shipboard radar operators, their voices now filtering directly into the pilots' headsets, updated the position of the bogies, now confirmed as hostile bandits, at 24,000 feet, just 30 miles out and closing fast. Tally-ho! One of his pilots, his eyes sharp, called out over the radio, the naval aviator's traditional term for making visual contact with the enemy. Bandits 2 o'clock high. A whole sky full of them. The serene, impossibly blue sky instantly erupted into a chaotic, three-dimensional maelstrom of twisting, white contrails as the Hellcats, holding the crucial altitude advantage, rolled over and plunged down on the unsuspecting and vulnerable Japanese formation. Brewer's first burst, a perfectly executed high-side deflection shot that he had practiced hundreds of times, tore into the wing root of a Zero, which immediately erupted in a brilliant orange ball of flame and began a sickening, uncontrolled, and terminal spiral toward the distant ocean. His wingman, in the same fluid, coordinated pass, targeted a Judy dive bomber, his concentrated stream of .50 caliber rounds catching the aircraft in the mid-fuselage and literally shearing the entire right wing from the airframe, sending it tumbling into the abyss. Within a chaotic, heart-pounding span of just 90 seconds, 8 Japanese aircraft were plummeting out of the sky, trailing fire, black smoke, and a shower of debris. The Hellcats' 6 heavy machine guns created a lethal, focus cone of fire, a zone of utter destruction at approximately 300 yards where all 6 streams of armor-piercing and incendiary bullets intersected. At that precise range, a brief 2-second burst delivered over 170 heavy-caliber rounds into a target area roughly 6 feet in diameter. The lightly built Japanese aircraft, designed with no self-sealing fuel tanks and no meaningful armor protection for the pilot, engine, or fuel systems, simply and utterly disintegrated under such a concentrated and brutal application of firepower. Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vijtasa, a seasoned and decorated pilot from the USS Yorktown, described the brutal, shockingly one-sided engagement. They came in a perfect, rigid formation, like they were on parade for the Emperor. We hit them from above and behind, diving out of the sun where they couldn't see us. It was like shooting clay pigeons at a county fair. I was stunned. They didn't even seem to try to evade. They just held their formation straight and level as we tore them apart one by one. By 11 a.m., The first Japanese wave, the pride of Ozawa's fleet, had been effectively and systematically annihilated. 42 of its 69 aircraft were confirmed as destroyed, with many others limping away, heavily damaged and forced to turn back. Only a handful of Japanese aircraft managed to penetrate the impenetrable fighter screen to make a desperate, suicidal attack run on the American ships. Of those, 7 were obliterated by the fleet's terrifyingly effective anti-aircraft fire, which now included the new and closely guarded secret weapon, the proximity-fused artillery shell. These revolutionary shells, a marvel of miniaturization, contained a small radio transceiver that automatically detonated the warhead when it passed within a lethal radius of an aircraft, eliminating the need for a direct hit and filling the sky with deadly, expanding clouds of high-velocity shrapnel. At 11:07 a.m., the radar scopes in the CICs across the fleet erupted again, even more intensely this time. The second and largest of the Japanese waves was inbound. This was a massive, awe-inspiring force of 128 aircraft, launched from the carriers Junyo, Hayo, and Ryuho. This formation was heavily weighted with bombers, including 53 of the fast Judy dive bombers, 27 Zero fighters flying a desperate escort, and a large and potent contingent of 48 Jill torpedo bombers, the most feared of all carrier aircraft. The strike was led by Lieutenant Commander Kazuo Takahashi, a highly experienced and respected veteran who had somehow survived 18 brutal combat missions, including the fierce and bloody battles at the Coral Sea and the Eastern Solomons. But this time, the Americans were more than ready. They were waiting, confident and utterly ruthless. The fighter directors, now with a crystal-clear picture of the enemy's tactics and approach vectors, vectored Fresh Combat Air Patrol, CAP, fighters to intercept this new raid a full 60 miles out from the task force, even further than the first. And again, the Hellcats held the crucial, non-negotiable energy advantage, circling patiently like hawks at 28,000 feet, waiting for the unsuspecting Japanese formation, which was lumbering along 9,000 feet below them at 19,000 feet. This immense advantage in potential energy, altitude that could be instantly and violently converted into speed, translated directly into absolute tactical superiority. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu's division, part of the second wave of launches, was among those scrambled to meet this second, larger raid. But as his Hellcat was launched from the pitching deck of the Lexington, he immediately felt that something was terribly wrong. A critical mechanical failure struck his engine. The supercharger, the very heart of the Hellcat's high-altitude performance, became stuck in the low blower setting. This crippling malfunction drastically limited his maximum speed to a sluggish 300 miles per hour and cut his potential rate of climb in half. By the time he struggled to reach a meager altitude, his squadron mates, their engines roaring at full power, had already pulled far ahead to engage the enemy. Alone, his aircraft laboring, Vrashu spotted the main Japanese formation far below him, a vast arrowhead of aircraft against the blue canvas of the sea. There were at least 50 of them, probably more, he later recalled. The Judy dive bombers were in a perfect, tight V formation. They were beautiful, but they looked like sitting ducks. Despite his significant and potentially fatal mechanical disadvantage, Vrashu, driven by a cold and calculated fury, executed a perfect diving boom and zoom attack from directly above and behind the unsuspecting Japanese formation, using his altitude to generate the speed his engine could not. His first target, a Judy, exploded immediately as his incendiary rounds found a fuel tank, the bomber's own bomb load detonating in a massive, secondary fireball that rocked his own aircraft. He pulled up sharply, using his momentum to regain some precious altitude, rolled inverted to keep his eyes on the formation below, and dove again. The second bomber's entire tail section, empennage, rudder, and elevators, separated cleanly from the fuselage as his concentrated stream of .50 caliber rounds sawed through the aluminum structure like a chainsaw. The third kill came as Vrashu pulled out of his second dive and began the slow, laborious climb back for altitude. A fleeing Judy crossed directly in front of his nose, and he fired a short, precise, and economical burst that set the bomber's wing tanks ablaze. The fourth victim never saw him coming. Vrashu attacked from the bomber's most vulnerable blind spot, below and behind, his red tracers walking up the fuselage until the aircraft simply came apart in midair. For his fifth kill, Vrashu engaged in a tail chase with a Judy that was attempting to escape at low altitude, skimming the waves. Despite his reduced speed, he managed to close to point-blank range and fire a final, devastating burst, sending the bomber cartwheeling into the ocean in a shower of spray and debris. The sixth and final kill of this incredible solo sortie proved to be the most spectacular. As Vrashu lined up his shot on another fleeing bomber, the Judy's bomb load, likely cooked off by the intense heat of its own burning fuel tanks, detonated prematurely, creating a massive, expanding fireball that Vrashu was forced to fly directly through. Emerging seconds later, his aircraft singed but miraculously intact. In a dizzying, heart-pounding span of just 8 minutes, a single American pilot, flying a severely compromised aircraft, had single-handedly and systematically destroyed 6 enemy dive bombers, using a mere 360 rounds of his 2,400-round ammunition load. His astonished ordnance crew later calculated that he had held down the trigger for a total of less than 5 seconds to achieve his 6 kills. When he finally landed back aboard the pitching deck of the Lexington, he triumphantly and famously held up 6 fingers to the bridge, where Admiral Mitcher himself was watching, awestruck. A quick-thinking photographer from the ship's crew captured the moment, and the image of the jubilant, sweat-soaked young pilot became one of the most iconic and enduring of the entire war. The second Japanese wave had fared even worse than the first. Of its 128 aircraft, a staggering and almost unbelievable 97 were lost. Hellcat pilots officially claimed 70 of the kills, with the ship's increasingly accurate anti-aircraft guns accounting for another 20. Only 31 battered, bullet-riddled, and demoralized Japanese aircraft survived to limp back to their carriers. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was in full, bloody swing. The technological and training chasm that had opened between American and Japanese naval aviation had, by the afternoon of June 19, 1944, been revealed as an insurmountable and brutally decisive abyss, a fact that was being demonstrated with horrifying finality in the skies over Task Force 58. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat's very design and development was a powerful testament to a uniquely American industrial and engineering philosophy, one that prioritized iterative, pragmatic improvement based on 3 hard years of accumulated, bloody combat experience. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, a marvel of mass-produced precision and reliability, churned out a standard 2,000 horsepower, a figure that could be boosted to a staggering 2,200 horsepower with the use of water methanol injection for emergency power. This immense, readily available power drove a massive 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller featuring a constant speed control mechanism, a complex but vital device that automatically adjusted the pitch of the propeller blades for optimal performance at any altitude or airspeed, ensuring the engine was always operating at its peak efficiency. The Hellcat's maximum speed at its optimal altitude of 23,000 feet was a blistering 380 miles per hour. Its initial rate of climb exceeded a phenomenal 3,000 feet per minute, and its service ceiling reached a formidable 37,300 feet, allowing it to dominate the high-altitude environment where bomber interceptions took place. However, it was the Hellcat's comprehensive defensive systems that truly set it apart from its adversaries and became the cornerstone of its legendary reputation. A comprehensive suite of 212 pounds of strategically placed armor plating formed a protective cocoon around the pilot, the vulnerable oil cooler, and the engine's oil tank. The thick windscreen was composed of 1.5 inches of multi-layered, bulletproof glass, a barrier capable of stopping even high-velocity 20mm cannon rounds. And, perhaps most importantly, its self-sealing fuel tanks, constructed from a clever laminate of rubber and sealant compounds that would swell to seal punctures from bullets or shrapnel, all but eliminated the catastrophic, instantaneous fires that so frequently and tragically consumed Japanese aircraft. Its total internal fuel capacity was a generous 250 gallons, with the provision for a 150-gallon centerline drop tank that extended its combat range to an impressive 1,530 miles, a crucial factor in the long-range battles of the Pacific. The fire control system was a product of American mass production genius. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, each firing at a blistering rate of 850 rounds per minute, with a deep and generous magazine of 400 rounds per gun, for a total ammunition load of 2,400 rounds. The guns were meticulously harmonized by skilled armorers on the carrier decks to converge their fire at a single, devastating point approximately 300 yards in front of the aircraft, creating a concentrated impact zone where a brief 1 or 2-second burst could literally saw another plane in half. A cold, clinical, comparative analysis of its primary adversary, the once feared Mitsubishi A6M50, revealed the stark and ever-widening disparity. The Zero weighed a mere 6,025 pounds fully loaded, less than half the Hellcat's ponderous weight. Its maximum speed was 351 miles per hour, a full 30 miles per hour slower than the F-6F at combat altitudes. Critically, and tragically for its pilots, the Zero carried absolutely no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks, a design compromise that, while granting it phenomenal agility in the early war, now made it a fragile death trap. Its armament, consisting of 2 wing-mounted 20mm cannons with extremely limited ammunition of only 60 rounds each, and 2 rifle-caliber 7.7mm machine guns mounted in the cowling, was utterly ineffective against the armored bulk of the Hellcat. Other, more modern Japanese aircraft that participated in the battle fared little better. The Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, one of Japan's newest and fastest carrier aircraft, could reach a respectable 339 miles per hour, but it remained just as fragile and vulnerable to any hit, with a single incendiary bullet often being enough to ignite its unprotected fuel tanks and turn it into a funeral pyre. The Nakajima B-6 Angel torpedo bomber, the intended ship killer of the fleet, suffered from the very same vulnerabilities while being even slower and less maneuverable, making it easy prey for the prowling American fighters. This critical technological gap was tragically magnified and compounded by the near-total collapse of the once superb Japanese naval pilot training program. The pre-war Japanese naval aviators, the elite samurai of the skies who had dominated the Pacific in 1942, had received over 700 hours of intensive, highly selective flight training before they were deemed worthy of joining an operational unit. By 1944, the brutal, grinding attrition of the war had forced a desperate, wholesale acceleration of the training pipeline. New replacement pilots now averaged a mere 200 hours of flight time, with some, in the final desperate months of the war, being sent into the inferno of combat with as few as 100 hours of total flight time. Their training in essential skills like navigation, instrument flying, and aerial gunnery was rudimentary at best, a shadow of the rigorous curriculum of their predecessors. In stark and telling contrast, American naval aviator training had become a vast, efficient, and highly effective industrial process in itself. New naval aviators received a minimum of 600 hours of standardized, high-quality instruction before they were even allowed to attempt their first carrier qualification. Sprawling training bases in the sun-drenched states of Florida, Texas, and California were producing over 10,000 highly proficient naval aviators annually, a river of skilled manpower that the Japanese could not hope to match. At 10 a.m. on that fateful day, Admiral Ozawa, still aboard his flagship, and, due to poor communications and the optimistic reports of his returning pilots, still largely unaware of the catastrophic and almost total annihilation of his first 2 attack waves, launched his 3rd strike. This was a smaller, more hastily assembled force of 47 aircraft, launched from the decks of the carriers Itaku, Chiyoda, and Chitose. By now, The Japanese flight leaders had some grim inkling that the previous waves had encountered fierce and overwhelming opposition, as garbled and frantic radio transmissions had spoken of swarming enemy fighters. But their orders were absolute, and the warrior code demanded they press on. Lieutenant Yoshio Fukumura, leading a flight of 15 Zero fighters, had watched the few, battered and bullet-riddled survivors of the earlier strike struggle back to the fleet, their debriefings painting a terrifying and almost unbelievable picture of seemingly endless walls of Hellcats and impenetrable, explosive curtains of anti-aircraft fire. The American radar network detected this third wave at 1 p.m. at a range of 120 miles. The American fighter directors, now operating with a well-practiced, almost languid efficiency, having refined their interception tactics based on the morning's overwhelming successes, now orchestrated an even more complex and deadly defense. Instead of meeting the raid head-on, they vectored multiple CAP squadrons to attack from different directions and altitudes simultaneously, a sophisticated tactic designed to instantly shatter the Japanese formations and prevent any possibility of mutual support. Commander William Bill Dean, leading 20 Hellcats from the USS Hornet, executed a perfect high-side attack, his squadron diving out of the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The Japanese fighters, flying a protective weave above their vulnerable bombers, never saw the Americans until their red tracers started ripping through their formations. Dean's first pass destroyed 3 Zeros in less than 15 seconds. His wingmen, in the same breathtakingly fast diving attack, killed 2 more. With their escort fighters eliminated in the opening moments of the engagement, the remaining Hellcats fell upon the now defenseless and scattered bombers with a ruthless, predatory efficiency. Lieutenant James Shirley from the USS Bunker Hill described the one-sided slaughter with a chilling detachment. They just sat there in perfect formation while we shot them to pieces. There was no evasive action, no defensive tactics whatsoever. They just flew straight and level while we made pass after pass, like we were on a gunnery range. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb, flying his very first combat mission from the USS Hornet, encountered the scattered remnants of this third wave. In his after-action report, he wrote with a sense of almost surreal disbelief, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They just flew straight and level while I shot them down, one after another. After the third one exploded right in front of me, I actually started feeling sorry for them. Then I remembered the newsreels from Pearl Harbor, and I just kept on shooting." Webb, the rookie, destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft in this single, incredible engagement, becoming an ace in a day on his very first combat sortie. Of the 40 aircraft that made up the third Japanese wave, a mere 7, all heavily damaged, survived to return to their carriers. Not a single Japanese aircraft from this wave managed to get within 50 miles of the American ships. The fourth and final Japanese wave of the day, a force of 82 aircraft, was launched at 11:30 a.m. This strike included many of the remaining experienced pilots who had been held in reserve for what was intended to be the decisive, final blow. But the strike was plagued by disorganization, poor communication, and catastrophic navigational errors from the very beginning. Nearly half the formation, through a tragic and inexplicable navigational blunder, flew towards the island of Guam instead of towards the coordinates of the American fleet. Those that did manage to find Task Force 58 encountered a seemingly impenetrable, multi-layered wall of American fighters, stacked in deadly orbits from 10,000 to 30,000 feet. The Americans had now perfected their defensive system, with fresh fighters, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, constantly rotating into the combat zone to replace those who were running low. The American carriers had become a continuous, relentless conveyor belt of destruction, launching fighters, recovering them, rearming, refueling, and launching them again in a ceaseless cycle of overwhelming force. By 2:30 p.m., the fourth Japanese wave had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. While the Hellcats were dominating the air battle with a brutal efficiency, American submarines, operating silently and unseen beneath the waves, were delivering their own crushing and decisive blows to Ozawa's fleet. The USS Albacore, the same submarine that had sent the initial warning of the Japanese attack, had been tenaciously trailing the Japanese fleet since dawn. At 9:05 a.m., its commander fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the massive carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. One of the torpedoes struck home, and while the initial damage seemed manageable, volatile aviation fuel vapors began to spread insidiously throughout the ship's poorly ventilated lower decks. At 2:32 p.m., a massive cataclysmic internal explosion tore the Taiho apart from the inside out. The newest and largest aircraft carrier in the Japanese fleet, a ship that was supposed to be nearly unsinkable, sank, taking 1,650 of her crew with her to the bottom. A few hours later, the USS Kavala, on her maiden war patrol, scored 3 devastating torpedo hits on the veteran carrier Shokaku. Racked by uncontrollable fires and massive internal explosions, the hero of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz also sank, with the loss of 1,272 of her men. By the time the sun set on the bloody waters of the Philippine Sea on June 19th, the cold, hard arithmetic of destruction was staggering and undeniable. The Japanese had lost a catastrophic 346 carrier aircraft and approximately 50 land-based planes from Guam and Rota. 2 of their finest and most powerful fleet carriers were at the bottom of the sea. But most critically, over 400 of their irreplaceable, highly trained pilots and aircrew were dead. American losses, in almost unbelievable contrast, were a mere 29 aircraft lost in aerial combat and operational accidents, with the vast majority of the pilots being successfully rescued by destroyers and floatplanes. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it was gleefully christened by the victorious American pilots, was over, and it had been one of the most one-sided and decisive victories in the entire history of warfare. But the battle was not quite finished. On the following day, June 20th, American search planes finally located Ozawa's battered and retreating fleet. Admiral Mitchell made a difficult, risky, and courageous decision to launch a massive strike at extreme range, knowing full well that his pilots would have to fly back in the darkness. At 4:30 p.m., 216 American aircraft were launched into the fading light. They found the Japanese fleet at sunset, and in a chaotic and desperate twilight attack, they sank the carrier Hyo and 2 large fleet oilers, and heavily damaged several other ships. The return flight in the pitch-black darkness was a harrowing epic of navigation and survival. To save his exhausted and fuel-starved airmen, Admiral Mitchell made another famous and incredibly risky decision: turn on the lights. Every single ship in the massive Task Force 58 was illuminated, their powerful searchlights pointing straight up into the sky, creating a beacon of hope in the vast, dark ocean. Despite this incredible and unprecedented measure, a total of 80 aircraft were lost, either ditching in the sea due to fuel exhaustion or crash landing on the decks. However, aggressive and heroic rescue operations saved the lives of most of the crews. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the definitive, irreversible, and catastrophic end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective offensive force. In 2 brutal days, Japan had lost approximately 480 carrier and land-based aircraft, 3 of its precious fleet carriers, and the vast majority of its remaining veteran pilots. Admiral Ozawa's ambitious Operation Ago, which had been predicated on a rough and hopeful parity in pilot skill and aircraft performance, had instead collided with an American force that possessed superior training, superior aircraft, and superior technology, all of which was wielded with a ruthless and systematic efficiency. The technological and training gap had become an unbridgeable, fatal chasm. The captured Marianas would soon become the primary bases for the B-29 superfortresses that would bring the Japanese homeland under sustained and devastating strategic bombardment, a campaign of fire and destruction that would culminate in the atomic bombs that would finally end the war. The battle had validated every single aspect of American naval aviation doctrine, from the design philosophy of its aircraft to the crucial, force-multiplying importance of logistics, intelligence, and pilot training. The Hellcats' emphasis on pilot protection, Overwhelming firepower and rugged, durable construction had been proven absolutely correct. The Zero's design philosophy, sacrificing everything for ethereal maneuverability, had been rendered tragically and completely obsolete. But most of all, the battle was a testament to the skill, courage, and exhaustive training of the thousands of young American pilots who, in the span of a single, long tropical day, had systematically and completely annihilated their opponents. The age of the samurai aviator had ended, definitively replaced by a new era where systematic, industrial-scale superiority determined the outcome of battles. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu's 6 fingers, held up in a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph to Admiral Mitcher, became the battle's enduring and iconic image, a symbol of a victory so total, so one-sided, and so utterly catastrophic for the vanquished that it has been remembered ever since by the grimly appropriate and eternally famous name that the pilots themselves gave it: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.